So, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to the Great Books of China series. Uh, I'm gonna start talking here in this video about what this channel is going to be about. The idea is essentially to do a type of book blog where I will talk about a sequence of books that I'm reading right now from the classical Chinese tradition, books that I'm reading continually. And the idea is to create interesting content for people that might be interested in studying Chinese or Chinese literature by presenting works of Chinese literature directly in a sort of systematic fashion. I've been fascinated by seeing that there really isn't any resource on YouTube for this where everything exists. Um, and I think that is really a gigantic omission considering the importance of classical Chinese culture to world culture as a whole. And I think I've been thinking about why that might be so, and I think it partly reflects a sort of general trend in our culture at the moment of being very much oriented to the present all the time. There is this idea that you see everywhere, that variants of this idea at least, that things change so fast, so extremely fast, that history and the study of ancient culture basically only has a sort of curiosity value. And that, there are, of course, odd and perverse individuals like myself that get their kicks out of decoding and discussing all these ancient and obsolete ideas, but that the reasonable thing for a person of the 21st century to do is to attune yourself as much to the present moment as you can and not bother so much about what has been before. And I think that what lies behind this idea is that, it's actually a kind of healthy and natural concern with the future, coupled with the very anxious feeling that, since the world advances so incredibly fast now, it's the future that demands all our attention. That is, it was the luxury of past ages, slower ages, to be able to savor the accomplishments of the past, while we poor motherfuckers have to devote all our energies thinking about what might one fine day hit us in the head. And I think that there is some truth to that, but that is exactly what we need the humanities for, the proper humanities, with all the ancient literature for. And I will go on to develop this idea at length, I think, in future episodes of this series. But I can say already here that the basic idea is this, that precisely because the world is so variable today, because there is such a lot of surface noise in the signals that enter into our feeble primate brains all the time, that's exactly why we need to ground ourselves even further in the wisdom of the ages, so that we can stand on our own 2 feet in the mess that the present world is. And this point can actually be expressed the other way around too, because you could say that it is exactly because our modern education gives us no grounding whatsoever in the great constants of the human situation that the modern world appears like such an incomprehensible and frightening mess to our poor, disordered psyches. Anyway, so what I want to do here is to create a little environment for classical Chinese literature, which is, I think, the subject, I'm afraid to say, of every major area in the humanities. It's probably in the West the least understood and least adequately discussed of these areas in intellectual circles. Think about highly educated people, the type of people that are widely known for their intellectual capability, who regularly get to make pronouncements on culture and society in the media. They usually have a positively cartoonish idea about Chinese culture. They know that China is a country dominated by Confucian thinking, and they think they know what that means. And they might have read the Tao Te Ching. They might be to some extent knowledgeable about Zen Buddhism, and they might be capable of roughly dating 1 or 2 imperial dynasties. But I think even that is pushing it, actually. And if you look at popular knowledge on this subject, it is close to 0. The average person, and I mean the average educated person here, knows absolutely nothing about Chinese literature. He can't name a single book. He doesn't know even the most basic features of Chinese culture outside, I suppose, its culinary aspects. And I'm not saying any of this in order to make fun of it. I'm drawing attention to it as a very remarkable fact. You can take 1 minute to think about this. China has a literary civilization that is about 3,000 years old. And of all the major civilizations, it's also, well, it might be the one that has the most deeply rooted obsession with writing and literature as a cultural medium. I really want to get into that later, actually. And this obsession means that the sheer amount of literature out there that you can study is completely overwhelming. And you can add to this that this civilization is still alive and flourishing, and that its inheritors include all of Eastern and Southeastern Asia, which means that you have around 2 billion people, or close to a third of humanity, that are living manifestations of this culture. And then you might actually start thinking that this really sketchy knowledge that people have of the classical culture in this area, it's actually quite remarkable, not to say outright weird. And it's especially weird since the modern discourse in society continually keeps reminding us how important it is to take an interest in other cultures, right? How much other cultures have to teach us, how central intercultural communication is to the great problems of our historical moment, and how disastrous the consequences will be if we have too limited understanding of the other, and so on and so on and so on. This is the sort of things that you basically have to believe. You have to say all those things loudly and clearly at every juncture if you are going to be taken seriously at all in today's literary climate. And I can't really help thinking, when I look at this grotesque and endemic ignorance about Chinese culture, that all of that is nothing more than a rhetorical virus. People are taught to repeat this mantra, but they never understand it. They never take it to heart. I mean, you can't go around in today's polite society and say, well, I really think that only my own culture matters. I don't think it's very important to understand the major civilizations of the world. I have never understood the point of sitting down and learning about people that are very, very different from myself. But actually, that's exactly how people act. And, well, if you look at it from the other perspective, there are obvious reasons why it should be like that. Because if you look at the literary history of the world, you can divide it roughly into 4 major civilizations, which is a division I base on the classical language that was used within these cultural spheres. So first we have the Western civilization, which is mediated by Greek and Latin, combined with a largely Christian religious heritage. Then there's the Islamic civilization, which is mediated by Arabic, and to quite a large extent also by Persian. Thirdly, we have the Indian civilization, whose classical language is Sanskrit. And finally, there's China, which obviously is mediated by classical Chinese. And the first 3 of these, that is the Western, Islamic, and Indian civilizations, they're all very tightly interconnected. So firstly, if you look at a world map, you see that geographically, this is all mostly, but not exclusively, the territory of the Indo-European peoples. So the Indo-European peoples, that is a linguistically and genetically interconnected group of peoples that span the whole territorial range from Bangladesh to Ireland and basically everything in between. And Latin, Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, they're all Indo-European languages. So they derive from a common ancestor, which means fundamental similarities in the way these languages are constructed, and thus also the way all of these otherwise quite diverse cultures construct their basic cognitive maps of the world. And this whole area, which is mostly Indo-European ethnically, it's also philosophically, linguistically, and especially religiously injected with a heavy Semitic element. And this Semitic element is responsible for another type of cultural ethos within this region, which actually probably is older than the Indo-European one. Uh, you have the Egyptian civilization, you have the Akkadian, Babylonian civilization, which are the two earliest literary civilizations we know about. And they provide a sort of mythological superstructure for all of the following cultures in this part of the world. And we have the Hebrews, who injected their religious ethos in the West through Christianity. And we have the Arabs, who reinvented the same religious ethos, you should say, and in the form of Islam gave a very distinct coloring to the preceding civilizations wherever its force extended, mainly, of course, in the Middle East, but also in India and even in parts of Europe. So from the point of view of China, you could say that there are really only two distinct civilizations in the world. That on the one hand, you have this mishmash of Indo-European and Semitic, which takes up all the rest of the Eurasian continent, and afterwards, through colonialism, the rest of the world. And then there is East Asia, which in civilizational terms really means China. And China has, of course, not been completely isolated from the West or the rest. I don't know which term you find more proper here. The most important outside influence on China is Buddhism, which came to China from India at around the birth of Christ, growing in influence gradually through the first millennium or so after that. And this means that there is a tight link between the Chinese and Indian civilizations, even though, as far as I know, it mostly goes one way. So Indian civilization hasn't been very affected by the Chinese, but the other way around is very much the case. Actually, Buddhism is really the one quintessentially Indo-European religion. It's kind of a funny thing that the Indo-European peoples actually mostly have adapted Semitic religion, while Buddhism, which has a very global reach today, mostly is practiced by East Asian peoples in East Asia. But that's the exception to the isolation of China, and Chinese Buddhism is really something I will try to talk about in this series as well. But the major point I wish to make here, which I really want to ram in actually, is that there is no other civilization in the world, major civilization, that is as essentially other from a Western perspective as the Chinese civilization is. These other civilizations that I mentioned, they're also extremely different from each other. We feel that all the time when we interact with people from other cultures, but if you really dig into Chinese culture and if you study that deeply, you will begin to sense that all of these other differences actually conceal very fundamental similarities that you can have a very hard time getting into view, actually, if you don't have the outside perspective that you get by putting yourself in the perspective of the native Chinese cultures. So that's one of the main points I want to be emphasizing in this series. And actually, I think that the real reason that we as Western people tend to know much less about Chinese culture than we do even about the Islamic and Indian cultures is really this. India was colonized by Britain for about a century or so, and today they can explain their heritage to us in our own language, which has been hugely helpful. They know English much better than the Chinese do. And I think during the 20th century, all that resulted in a huge cultural transfer of Indian thinking into the West. So there's a whole section of society in the West that would consider themselves to be spiritually informed by beliefs that are essentially Indian, and who devote themselves to spiritual practices which, if they're not entirely Indian, at least they're developed within that basic cultural context and inspired by the Indian classical culture. And Islamic culture, on the other hand, that's turned into the real other for the Western culture to mirror itself in, particularly during the last few decades. But that's an old phenomenon as well. And the West is today engaged in a rather painful kind of cultural conflict with Islam, as you know, which focuses the attention of a lot of people on Islamic culture. And even if it's frequently the case that Muslim culture is demonized and mischaracterized, there is quite a lot of information traded over the borders, and people, for better or worse, do take a kind of genuine interest in this culture. But with Chinese culture, people are strangely indifferent. We don't have a natural connection to them, it seems. And this is even mirrored in political reality today. Because the Chinese regime, as you might know, is hell bent on not adopting any outside influences, which means that communication is vastly circumscribed in purely practical terms. Um, as you know, all significant communication happens online today, and the Chinese regime has helped to create a whole online world that is 100% Chinese, where outsiders don't participate, and they in their turn need special software to access the websites that the rest of the world uses. And that's just one example, but it really indicates that the cultural communication between China and the rest of the world it's a mere fraction of what it could be. So for anyone who really wants to study cultural differences, China is your bet. That's my point. And if you want to go do it deeply, you can't make a better choice than studying classical Chinese. Because if you do that, you will get a sense of that all these things that you think are cultural differences are actually no more than cosmetics. Because contrary to what you might have been told, you're not putting yourselves in the shoes of the other, making a sort of big quantum leap in your intercultural understanding just because you interact with some random so-called marginalized group in your own society. That is a parody of humanism. Differences between gender, race, social class, the whole deal, are not fundamental differences. If you speak the same language, if you exist within the same spatial and temporal dimension, you don't actually have to make a huge intellectual effort to understand people that are different from you in those regards. All that you need is a little bit of goodwill. You need some basic common sense, which is important, of course, but you're not gaining a radically new perspective by doing this. And what I will do in this series is instead try to show you barriers to understanding that go really, really deep. And I will try to show you how these barriers can be overcome. And for those of you who are young enough to be inclined to try this for yourself, which means that you'll have to spend quite some few years to mastering this language, I will try to show you, apart from giving you information on the Chinese culture and the literature, I will try to show you some philosophical techniques for doing this. Try to bring some theoretical perspectives to bear on this exceedingly difficult problem of bridging cultural gaps. But for everyone else who might be listening, who might not be in a position to dive all the way into this rabbit hole by themselves, I will try to give you a sense of the actual human voice of the authors that I talk about as well. I want to try to make them speak to the present. And I want to try to give you a sense that what they say are relevant to you, whoever you might be. And I also want to be as informative as I can about the really, really basic facts of human history and culture that you're usually not taught with the whole package that you're being fed normally. And I thought that maybe I should also use this space in this first introduction to make clear some of my own personal convictions about this sort of thing. My metaphysics, if you might say that. To me, the study of canonical literature is a sort of transcendent activity. I ascribe to it a transcendental value. It's not reducible to any other sort of experience, and I believe that it is the most profoundly useful activity that there is if you pursue it properly as well. So it's not a hobby, it's not an interest among other interests. And I know that that might sound extremely overblown and pretentious, but you should remember when I say that for most of human history, I would be speaking merely from a position of accepted common sense. Because every culture that ever developed writing also developed a canon of sacred writings. And these sacred writings, I view them as being the most genuine outer expression of the truest inner life of the people making up these cultures. And I think that these texts and their status within their respective cultures are the firmest evidence there is for that. um, I'm really, really very firmly convinced that the study of classical languages and sacred writings is something that a culture simply cannot do without in order to survive. Um, it's not an antiquarian curiosity, but it's the most effective way to reach into the soul of another human being and finding at the root the thing that unites you with that other human being. And I mean unite in the very most extreme sense of the word. Because what deep study of classical literature should result in is, in my view, a sense of the basic indivisibility of human experience. It should give you a sense that we are all expressions of a single, all encompassing universal consciousness, and that we come to life dressed in individual garments in order to act out the infinite potential of being, but that we at the core share a single transcendental, immanently present, and inexhaustible identity. And all traditional cultures have sensed this. I think you can imagine that it was some sort of mysterious force almost that led them to study the way of the forefathers uh, in books, song, scripture, the works of genius, cultivating, this sense of belonging, this common identity through excavating in a meditative way all these books, the Vedas, the sayings of Confucius, the Bible, the epics of Homer, you name it. All of that has worked. It has worked for thousands of years. In the West, as long as people still went to school and learned Latin and Greek, I think you could be said that there was such a thing as Western culture, which I'm not sure exists anymore. And Chinese culture was held together for over 2,000 years through studying the classical literary canon and its language. And we have lost the sense of the importance of this because we have stopped understanding that this heritage is a living and inescapable part of your own being. And I mean this quite literally, even though I can't explain it in detail right now. Whether you know it or not, there is a part in you that is able to respond internally, physically, you might say, to the words of Chinese sages, provided that you yourself have made this possible through study and intense sympathetic meditation on the meaning of these words. And, millennia of human civilization have understood that this is the beginnings of wisdom, that is the proper basis for cultivating your character, and it is an absolutely necessary component in ordering society. And compared to the people of millennia, we are babies. We are school children. We are absolutely bent on doing everything we can to skip class. That's one point. The most important point, however, is I think that this is the most profoundly useful thing that you can do for yourself as well. And people might say, well, what's the point of knowing what Confucius said? What's the point of knowing the stories of the Bible? What is the point of knowing Greek mythology? And, there is actually no point at all if you look upon it as a matter of simply being able to tell you the contents, like tell you what the books are about. If you think that these kind of studies aim at knowing factual content, you're thinking about it in the worst possible way. Because you can read a Wikipedia article in order to do that, and it won't change you in any way. But the fundamental point of this exercise is to change yourself and to heal yourself. And you heal as an individual by realizing, in essence, that you're not alone. That when you realize that all your struggles, your frustrations, your battles, your suffering has a general element to them, which makes them fundamentally not your own to bear. And canonical literature allows you to communicate with this fundamental layer in your own soul. So if you pursue these studies properly, they are therapeutical in the deepest sense of the word, because you share your being with billions of living and non-living members of the human race, And the human race is one manifestation of the incredible life force of the entire universe. And you can only be healed by sensing unity and participation in this current of life. And you need to be healed. And canonical literature will help you do this, because realizations of this kind provide the bridge between what otherwise would be unbridgeable gaps in human experience. So the canonical literature gives you the lock, you might say, and it gives you the task of finding the proper key to unlock it. And it's only from proceeding from an assumption of fundamental identity with everything that you can understand a message that's written in ancient words. And when everything clicks, you know it. You will feel a psychological or physiological reaction. Physiological reaction, I would say. You instinctively know what understanding is like. And that sounds mysterious, I suppose, if you haven't felt it. And it's certainly difficult to explain, but it's also a basic matter of fact. So I'll leave it at that to begin with as an introduction, and I'll try to get in some actual works of literature in the next part of this series. Thank you for listening.